I question what it means to be Japanese American a lot for me. And that's kind of one poem where there's a bit of ambivalence celebrating a day called Fred Kormant's Day. But this next poem is about a writer named Iris Chang, who was a historian, who wrote a book called The Rape of Nanking, detailing the Japanese Imperial Army's invasion of that city in 1937. And what people have described as an atrocity of indiscriminate killing of men, women, and children, up to several hundred thousand, maybe 300,000. There's just different estimates. And this poem for me is another example of kind of questioning what does it mean to be Japanese American? I'm Japanese American. I'm born in the United States, but there's this history that's also part of the culture that I'm a part of. And so I wrote this poem. It's called 17 Reasons Why Iris Chang Still Appears, for Iris Chang and Wing Tek Lum. Wing Tek Lum is another poet who wrote about the Nanjing Massacre in a different book, some very graphic poems in that book about that attack. 17 Reasons Why Iris Chang Still Appears. I read her book, The Rape of Nanking. I believe she did not commit suicide as reported. I remember her fear-glazed eyes when I saw her in the bookstore promoting her last book, The Chinese in America. I felt perceived as guilty for being Japanese when I walked past the event space where she was speaking. I read in a biography by her mother that on that final book tour, Iris encountered a threatening man who said, "You should join us if you know what's good for you." And Iris, stunned, walked away. I have read a series of brutal and graphic poems by Wing Tek Lum, who has spent 10 years writing about the Nanjing Massacre after he read The Rape of Nanking. I think of her ghost while driving on Highway 17, near where her body shot through the mouth was found. I apologize for that last image, modeled after Wing Tek Lum's, but should you accept this apology? I remember a coworker stating that Iris took her own life because of the things she wrote about, and I thought that was what we were supposed to think. I have read that Japanese officials continue to deny the Nanjing Massacre today or downplay it, and that old right-wing factions may try to silence you if you say otherwise. I wonder if we must be prepared to give up our lives in mass protest when those in power finally achieve what they've been threatening all along. I attended an international conference on Asian American Studies in Asia in Taipei, where 2 Taiwanese participants said they could never go to Japan because of what the government there had done to Taiwanese and Chinese people in the last century. I met a filmmaker from Indonesia who jokingly stated that the Japanese were the Nazis of Asia. I once drunkenly proclaimed my strange feelings of guilt about being Japanese and about Japan's historical atrocities while eating at a German restaurant in San José. I am not from Japan, although I have affinities, and my relationship to the internment is a psychic split between us, the J and the JA. I no longer believe in coincidence, so when I thought about Iris recently while driving on Highway 17, a route I take weekly, it was part intention, part providence. I will likely write about this in whatever form it takes, with as many forms as it takes. Thank you. We could talk more maybe later, Jonathan, about that one, but yeah. So, and then other poems in this book are about family, as I mentioned. And my mother actually, who passed away in 2019 from Alzheimer's disease, I have a couple of poems about her in this book. And, you know, the title said Asian music. It is a book about grieving and loss in many ways. And so I'll read a poem about her. This one is called Mother Memory. And it's about a time in which, you know, I think a lot of us who are of a certain age find that our parents can no longer do certain things that they used to be able to do. In my mom's case, her memory, anyway, that's what this is about. So I think you'll get it as I read it. Mother Memory. My mother may be having memory problems. Is it due to a lack of social contact? Yet she does have friends, Mari, Kazuko, and another whose name I forget. Our memory of a feeling without words inspires loss, sadness, an only son and single mother. Meeting my father's mother for the first time in 2009, she remembers more than most at her age, 96. We are lucky she tells her story, recorded on video, a vulnerable medium for memory. Are we making new memories, my mother and I? She seems to be going along without attachment. She tells me to stay at my new job for the pension. She tells me not to spend too much. She reiterates not to waste as if I had not heard her before, yet she did call to make sure I returned from my week-long trip okay. She is not reading books anymore after a lifetime of reading. She is soft-spoken. She still laughs at my sarcasm. My partner and I watched the newest Jane Eyre movie, and I remember how my mother used to watch different versions of this film. How much I believe my mother identified with Jane, who ran away from Rochester and briefly lived in a modest space alone, which my mother sort of lives in now, in a small apartment among other seniors. No need for man, she intimates, except for me, who takes her out to lunch or dinner sometimes. I think my mother used to identify with Mary Tyler Moore in the 1970s and with Audrey Hepburn in Breakfast at Tiffany's. I'm sure the interment plays a part. Today I no longer know. If my mother is losing her memory, then perhaps those older memories remain intact, not the newer ones. Our more recent outings together she may have forgotten. Perhaps even her visit to Taiwan seeing us during Chinese New Year. I am reluctant to confirm this with her. Is that how memory fades? Thank you. I use the word internment a number of times in these poems, and I kind of don't use that word myself anymore. I actually prefer to use the word incarceration, and that could be probably a subject of another conversation. But when it came time for me to consider changing those words, I had written these poems and they had already had a sound in my mind. And so I kept the word internment, even though I might not use that word as much today to describe. And talking to this audience, I don't think I have to really say too much about that, but I think we all understand what the differences are. Wish I had a happy poem to read you, but I don't really have happy poems in this book. Or even maybe a funny one. I don't.
We have to change the title.
What I do have in this book, though, are quite a few short poems. They're like 4 words, and they're actually inspired by these sort of Chinese idioms that kids used to have to learn in I think throughout Asia, even in Japan, China, Taiwan. And they were 4 characters, and they were often they were often kind of like an aphorism, or had a sort of a pithy or a meaning behind them. And one example is one that my friend's mother would say, and forgive me if I'm not pronouncing the tones correctly, but it's Hua Long Dian Jing. And so Hua Long, Hua is paint, Long is dragon, Dian is to make a dot, and then Jing is eye. So you paint the dragon and dot the eye. This idea that you make it, this painting comes to life only after you put that final finishing perfect sort of touch on it, which is the eye of the dragon. And another version of the story is that the dragon actually comes to life and flies off the canvas. And so those 4 character aphorisms kind of inspired me to write my own 4-word poems. And they kind of appear throughout the book as on their own page, as a way to kind of give you a little bit of a break from the longer, maybe more intense pieces. And I kind of see it as like pickled ginger when you're eating sushi and you've got ginger on the side and you want to kind of just, cleanse your palate a little, maybe forget that last piece and then go on to the next. So that's what these little, and so that's kind of, they're sort of scattered throughout. And so I might just read 1 or 2. Let me read one. I'll read 2. So this one's, there's no title. Here's one. Mention the fading trees. I'll read it again. Mention the fading trees. I'll read one more. Truth, belief, crime, teeth. So, did that cleanse your palate? So yeah, so those are throughout. And then debating what I should read next. I'm gonna read this poem about my cousin Wayne. And I have to be careful because if I talk too much about it, it's hard for me to read it. But Wayne was my cousin, and when we were kids, you know, my family after the war, after they got out of post on my mother's side, they went back to farming strawberries in the Santa Clara Valley. So that's just south of San Jose, so like Coyote, Gilroy, San Martin. And so they lived, they were sharecroppers, and they lived actually on the strawberry fields. So when I was a child growing up in the 1970s, I lived in San Jose, but I would visit my grandparents in, at that time, San Martin. And they still lived on the strawberry. So the strawberry fields, it was basically their backyard. And my cousin Wayne lived with his family right next door. So we would play in the strawberry fields together. Then the other part of this poem is that my cousin Wayne, he committed suicide right after the LA uprising in 1992. So, and you know, I was 22, he was 24, and you know, for me, someone my generation, that was the first time I had seen something like that. I know there were other, you know, there was Watts before I was born, and then, but this was like kind of the first for me. So a lot of it we saw on television, right? Not just Rodney King's beating before that, but then the so-called riots or uprising the next year after the 4 officers were acquitted. And so right after that, yes, my cousin kind of shocked us all and passed. And so this is called Wayne. He died young, 24, due to a civil war in the streets between black and white and a few Koreans with guns on LA rooftops. And others watched or ran, and he watched, ran, got a gun too, against those who beat Rodney King that night, beat him and went free, causing the riot. A white truck driver pulled from his cab and stoned and punched and kicked on TV. He watched that passively as one could watch that, and it was painful to the other him watching, triggering a memory. He remembered a gun dormant under a bed, a gun used for hunting, said the TV news, a gun that fired semi-automatic rounds under and over police cars, injuring 2 officers at an armory where he stopped to end the force of the state he was in. We figured it must make sense at his age, 24, depressed, a time that has been repeated again and again. If only that were the sound of him coming back again from the fields where we played among the strawberries. Thank you. So, maybe one more. Is that okay? Why don't I read one more about my mother? Or should I read a short one just to take a little break? But this one this one's called "My Mother Might Be a Stellar's J." Okay. While washing the dishes, I suddenly recall that my mother is gone. She will not be there to hear my complaints, or smile or laugh at my sarcasm. She's a phantom person, like a phantom limb of memory. My feeling for the world at times relies on her being there. Now she is gone, and I try not to go further into that space. Perhaps I believe she is now a Stellar's J in the neighborhood, because I called out my abandonment, and a Stellar's J replied, perched on a phone line outside my window. Its black head and blue body, the colors my mom would have liked, and its rough caw or rasp. Later in the day, I saw it again, perched on a roof. I tried to take a picture of it, and it flew away. Typical. My mom never liked taking photos. She rarely looked at the camera. I always thought it was my fault, perhaps something about not wanting to be captured by the too often male gaze, even her son's. Or was it a reflex by the time I was born, to be there and not look at anything, or appear not to look? Weeks later, I saw two Stellar's jays on another roof playing together, or perhaps conversing with great animation, as one flitted about, leaving the other one alone for a moment. My mom liked to be alone. She did not want to be bothered. So few people ever knew her, as if she came and went without much notice. In her illness, her memory loss became my memory loss. Did she remember taking me to see that popular movie when I was 5? If she can't remember, then do I remember? And did we ever see it together? That memory lodges in the body and depends on her body being present. That now gone, the result is that perhaps no memory exists. We never saw that movie together. I have now seen it alone. When two people make a memory together and one of them dies, the memory becomes hollow or hard to locate. It cannot be conjured as before because the connection to the other that made it is gone. Still, this explanation does not satisfy. So let me stop and say my mom is a Stellar's jay, a bird native to the western third of North America. I might hear one now in the distance as I write this, that unmistakable double caw or rasp. I've probably been listening to it forever. Thank you.
Well, that was a very nice tribute, very reflective memory of your mother. And I should mention that Steve was raised by a single parent and didn't meet his father until well into his adult life. Yeah.
No, that's another story. Yeah, I didn't know. I knew who my father was, what his identity was. I knew his name, and I actually had a photo of him for many, many years. But yeah, I was raised by my mother, so single parent mother, and I was the only child, and so it was just the two of us. But I decided finally to search for my father in my 30s. I was like 38, and I went online and I found his wife teaching or working at Berkeley Lab at the time, and I emailed her, and I got together. I was living in Taiwan at the time, and I ended up flying back to the U.S. to meet him and his wife, and I have a brother and sister, and now I have a niece, and I at the time I also had a grandmother. It's just been I'm lucky.
So when you were explaining your latest publication, I'm glad you were able to share some of your humor with the audience, because when Jill first asked me to go if I would moderate this reading, South Asian music, I thought, boy, what is Steve all about here? But when we got together for lunch, I could see right away you had a sense of humor about yourself and your life, and that was a great relief to me. But when you write about all the various topics, does that kind of relieve the burden of that history, or shift it in any way? Like Iris Chang or Wayne, your cousin?
Well, I'm glad it's out there. Yeah, there's stories. I think we should all be telling our story. I mean, if we feel safe and comfortable. I mean, actually, it's not safe and comfortable to tell these stories, frankly. You know, because I'm telling stories about family who I don't know how they would feel if they were alive. I mean, to hear them, but um, yeah, I mean, for me, I just had to tell. I mean, I just had to write these pieces. Frankly, yeah. Wayne, and I don't want to speak too much about it because it's kind of probably I'll be incapable of speaking. But I've been wanting to write about him for years, decades. You know, he passed away in 1992. I wrote that, the poem that I read. I wrote that in 2012. So like 20 years later. And I don't know if it was. I don't know if it was cathartic. Actually, when I read it, I do feel a heightened sense of connection with something. I actually do. It's probably one of my favorite poems, and I read it almost everywhere. So hoping that people are not bored if you've heard it before. But yeah, I feel this. Emily Dickinson once said that, you know, when she reads poetry, I'm not saying this is that quality, but she gets this feeling that the top of her head is coming off. The top of her head is coming off, and so I think it's kind of water circulating through your body in a very unique way when it encounters the energy that people have sometimes when they're talking or reading or just being near you. And so when I read that particular poem, I get a rush of energy most of the time. Yeah. So I don't know if that answers your question.
Well, and another thing we talked about was that you said at one point you were just sort of writing for yourself.
Yeah.
And then at some point you decided to go back to creative writing at San Francisco State. Is there anything in your life that propelled you to go back and?
Yeah, no, I've always wanted to write, and even when I was younger, I thought I would do a creative writing program in my 20s. I got out of my undergrad, and then I went right into a PhD program, actually, critical theory at University of Washington. And I realized after writing one paper about my family, using that language, the language of academic, like post-structuralist language, that I felt it was a big betrayal, frankly. It was not a language I wanted to use to describe my family. And I had wished at that time that I had gone into a creative writing program, but I didn't. And I would not go into a creative writing program for another maybe 20 years. So I wrote very much almost in isolation. I did kind of workshops here and there, but I wrote mainly, by myself. And some of the poems in here, you know, no one really read them until many years later. The first poem I got published in 2015, I wrote in 1994. So I mean, I've been sitting on some of these poems for many, many years. And then, but yeah, I decided that probably when there's a lot of things that pushed me to decide to go into the SF State program in 2012. I had a partner who was very supportive at that time, who was constantly, you know, giving me sort of that feedback and support about my work and kind of pushing me, nudging me to kind of think of a plan. And then I also got some career counseling. Because we moved back from Taiwan to the United States, I didn't know what I wanted to do here, and there was still a recession. And so I started seeing a career counselor. He was not a career counselor, he's like more of like a career coach or a coach. And I realized while talking, and we did these physical exercises, and one time we were doing these exercises where he asked me to push against him. He had his hand against my shoulder, and I was supposed to push against him, and I was supposed to answer these questions he was giving to me. And at one point I just realized I want to write. I want to go back to school. And so I applied to SF, and I didn't want to move outside of the Bay Area, so I only had SF State and maybe one or two other. So I only applied to SF State because I knew it was a diverse student body. I wanted diversity. The teachers were, anyway, but yes, so I got into that program, and I wrote a number of the poems that are in here, and and I got a lot of feedback, and for me, it was great. I did the MA, not the MFA, so I got out after 2 years. But yeah, I think that did, but then I didn't do anything for a year after that, you know? People go through an MA program or an MFA program, and most people don't actually continue writing. They don't. And I thought, am I going to continue writing? And then I went back to another workshop that I had done 20 years before, and that pushed me to actually share more writing. And I got involved with Kearny Street Workshop shortly after that. And Kearny Street Workshop was great because I love their mission statement. It's something like, you know, we make writers out of community members and community members out of writers. And I think it's so true. I think when I was part of APAture, and Kearny Street really gave me a platform to really share with an Asian American audience, who I didn't have to explain anything to really. So from there, I just started to get more involved. And with social media and stuff, it was very easy to make connections and get more involved in readings and more involved in writing and meeting other people. But for me, it was such a long process. Like I'm 52, you know, and this book is coming out this year. So you know, I don't know if this is the measure of a writing life, but I mean, definitely it's something. so yeah.
Yeah, better late than never. But what was the actual inception of this publication? I mean, was there something that said, okay, I gotta find a publisher and I've gotta go run through all the hoops and submit and get really serious?
Well, you have to submit, and you can submit to contests, you can submit to publishers that have an open reading period. Frankly, you know, it's exhausting for me to do that. I mean, I wasn't really submitting much at all. Figuring out where to submit to, that's a huge challenge it was for me. But I don't know, you know, you get a feeling that maybe you have a chance here and there. So I submitted this to the Finishing Line Press fee-free open reading period. Every November, they have a period where they don't charge a fee. So I submitted I submitted a chapbook, a much shorter volume, like about 25 pages, to their chapbook submission. And then they accepted it. And then they said, well, you know, if your book's gonna be more than this number of pages, we're gonna have to sell it as full length. And I said, well, can I just add more poems to it and make it a full length real full length? And so the editor reviewed the extra poems. She said, yeah, go ahead, you can put these poems in there. So that's how it became a full length book. So everyone has their own story, I guess, about the publishing process. I mean, that's just my story. There's so many other experiences out there, I'm sure. But yeah, that's what happened. I just submitted it and it was accepted, and I went through this process of 2 years of getting it to this point. I had a lot of doubts too, frankly. I mean, you never know for sure if this publisher is the right one for you. And then I didn't sign the contract for months, actually. I just wasn't sure if I wanted to go with them. But then I also thought, well, I'm 50, and how much longer do I have? I mean, I want to get something. I felt a compulsion at my age to also get something out there. So, but I'm happy. I'm happy that this is out there, and the cover I'm just so thrilled about because of the meaning it has for me and the connection I feel that I have with.
Maybe it's a little too early to ask, but what's next? I mean, do you have,
writing?
Yeah, do you have other poems that you'd like to publish?
I actually don't have any other poems at the moment. I'm trying to work on a memoir, actually. I'm trying to work on a memoir about my mother. I know one person I think in the online audience knows a little bit about this because I just had a workshop with her in August where I shared some of my memoir. The memoir focuses on films that my mother and I watched together. Because I realized that that was one thing she really liked to do. She liked reading, and she liked watching movies. And so there's a lot of memories I have of watching movies in the theater, watching films on television. And there are some films that you just know have this sort of resonance with with a person you're watching it with. And one of those films happened to have been Grease, and the musical from 1978. And I'd have to tell a long story, but I don't know what. So in my memoir, I start out where my mom has passed away. She was living at a boarding care home in El Cerrito, and she passed away. And the boarding care home owner my car wasn't working, strangely enough. I couldn't drive there. And so the owner said, Steve, would you like to see your mom? I said, well, yeah, I'd like to see my mom. So he picked me up, and in his car, this is like 10:30 at night. In his car was this Toyota, and he had the radio on at very low volume. And so we're driving from my home to El Cerrito, not very far. And we're just kind of talking small talk. And then as he's parking the car in front of the boarding care home, I suddenly noticed, just before he turned off the ignition, I noticed that the song on the radio was Hopelessly Devoted to You by Olivia Newton-John, right, from the movie Grease. And it was uncanny, because I just thought, this is like one of my mom's favorite songs, right? And it's playing right now. As I'm about to get out of the car and go see her, and she had just passed away. And so I go from there. I talk about Greece, but there was this feeling for me that she was kind of maybe communicating to me through that song. And I've had that experience with other songs on the radio, or even just random TV things. And so, I talk about films and how they kind of show us who we are in a lot of ways, or how they demonstrate who my mom was and who I am, right, in relation. So yeah, so that's what I'm trying to work on. We'll see. I don't know. It's. I've only got like 30 pages. Well, that's not too few pages, but I'm just writing things. I'm just writing it down. I'm not really focused on trying to organize it in any particular way. Just all these films, and my mom and I, the ones that we watched. Or maybe I might have watched a film separate from my mom, but it has something to say about who I am, who she might have been. And I talk about all kinds. I love films. So I talk about international Japanese films. I talk about films made in the U.S. I talk about I work at BAM PFA, the Berkeley Art Museum and Pacific Film Archive, and one of my favorite things to do there is to see free films. So so why not? I like to talk about. I like to watch films, and I like to talk about films. So this is combining those two elements.
So it's really interesting how you mentioned this kind of coincidence of hearing this music from Greece as you're pulling up to visit your mom. But then you also mentioned something in that poem with Irish Chang when you're driving on Highway 17, that this is part of Providence. Yeah.
Providence.
Yeah.
Yeah. I wrote that poem. I was going to SF State at the time. I was living in Santa Cruz, and I was driving to San Francisco State once a week to take my 2 classes for my degree. And I would always drive on Highway 17 as part of that route to get to San Francisco. And I don't think everyone knows this, but Iris Chang was a San Jose resident when she passed away, and she was found in her car just off of Highway 17, shot by a gunshot wound. And so I would drive Highway 17 once a week at that time, and I would think about her when I was driving to my class. And so that's where I think the poem comes from in that sense. And this idea of I intentionally thought about her, but also there was this other, I use the word providence. I don't even know if that's still the best word, but this other thing beyond my intention that brought her to my attention to write about her. And then that poem also has a lot of other moments in my life where I've encountered being very self-conscious and maybe even feeling very uncomfortable when this history is brought up. This Japan's imperial sort of history in Nanking, and then through World War II. I lived in Taiwan for 4 years, so I know, I got to know Japan's colonial history there. I mean, that was like over 50 years. 1898 through the end of World War II. So, and there's a lot of Japanese buildings still in Taiwan from that period that were built during that time. And many older people in Taiwan still, they know Japanese because they were forced to have to learn it and speak it. So I would be there as a Japanese American, and occasionally an older person would come up to me in Taiwan and say, first of all, they'd get very surprised. I lived in a small town, and they would say, "Nihonjin desu ka? You're Japanese." And then they start talking to me in Japanese super fast. I can't understand. I mean, I took Japanese in college years ago, but unfortunately I don't know. I'm not as fluent as this person who had to learn it and still remembers it. But I wasn't expecting this excitement and this sense of wanting to talk to me in Japanese. I would have to explain that I'm Japanese American. I was born in the United States, and I even learned how to say I'm at the time, third generation Japanese American in Mandarin. And we could talk more about that. I found out later I'm actually fourth generation, but that's a different. But so back to the Irish Chang poem, that's kind of in it. And then when I went to that Asian American Studies in Asia conference in Taipei, that's another big story, but that's in it where I don't know if I should be telling all these stories. This poet Wing Tek Lum was at this conference, this Asian American Studies in Asia, and all these academics from the US, from different parts of Asia came to talk about that topic and to present papers. And one person was Wing Tek Lum, a Chinese American, Hawaiian Chinese American poet. He was there, he read a manuscript that he was still working on, I think roughly called the Nanjing Poems. And these are all poems that were inspired by Irish Chinese book and by his own research into that atrocity. And they were very graphic poems. So that we were all sitting there listening to these very graphic poems of violence and just brutality. And we were just like, where do we go from here? And then finally two participants, one Taiwanese and one Chinese, I believe, said they could never go to Japan because of what the Imperial Army had done during World War II. And other people were kind of talking about this. And then this one other academic who was Korean American and she was teaching in South Korea said, well, I'm curious to hear from our Japanese colleagues, what you might think. Do you have any response to this? And I was like kind of shaking in my seat because I wanted to say something, but I didn't know what to say. And I'm like, in this huge, this big convening of academics. And I'm like, oh God, And then thankfully, this other person who was from Japan, whose academic focus was on Japanese American literature, but she was Japanese, and she said, well, it was a difficult time, and it was such a long time in the past, and I know that we need to keep talking about it, but please come to Japan. So please come. And so when she said that, everyone just cracked up. So it was great because it just kind of lightened that moment because there was such an intense focus on everyone, on me, I felt, and probably on her and other people. But who knew? I didn't know where it was going to go. And when she said, "Please come to Japan," then we all kind of were able to kind of breathe again and sort of continue. But yeah, so the Irish Chang poem references that experience as well as a number of other things. I did meet a filmmaker from Indonesia who I was just joking with her, and at one point she said, "Well, hey, aren't the Japanese the Nazis of Asia?" And so it's all in a lot of different moments are in that particular poem.
But as a JA,
yeah,
what is your response? What would have been your response if someone asked you?
My response.
Yeah.
To besides cowering and shame.
Don't ask me.
Well, if you ask me now, that's why I wrote the poem because it's a big concern of mine, and I believe what I've been reading. Irish Chang's book basically changed my life. When something changes your life, you don't realize it till years later. Well, I realized that book when I read it changed my life, and so when I saw her, that's another moment in that poem. As I was working at Barnes and Noble, I was an assistant store manager at the time. She was in my bookstore doing an event for her last book, The Chinese in America, and because I was managing, I was walking back and forth. Every time I walked past the event space where she was speaking, I felt like I was guilty. Even though she was talking about the Chinese in America book, not the rape of Nanking book. The rape of Nanking book was already over a decade old, but I felt this feeling, and so, but if you had asked me, I wish I had talked to her. I wish I had gone up to her, but she also was very, her eyes were just kind of glazed over. She looked like she was just almost disassociating. And I didn't want to approach her in that way. And it was very eerie. And then shortly after that, she was found dead off of Highway 17. So I know she was going. I read the biography by her mother about Iris, which it might be a little skewed because she's a parent, but I think there's a lot of details in that book that kind of give you a clue as to what Iris might have been going through before she committed suicide. But I'm not, so yes, but I would today say, read about that and learn about it and talk about it. And for me, it's still something I care about to engage with and learn.
I'm wondering, are any questions from the people here or online? Give people a few moments to think about that.
So I have a question. Why did you take that cover for your poems?
Oh, this cover?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I can't see it really well.
Oh, well.
What does it say to you?
Well, it's an abstract poem or abstract painting.
Oh,
Yeah, by Hideo Kobashigawa, and I picked it because again I learned about him when I was taking classes at SF State when I was doing my master's, and this is another life-changing moment for me. But I had to take an elective or literature class, so I decided to take Japanese American literature, art and literature, which was taught by Betty Kano, which probably a lot of you know. And so that's where I learned about this artist and many other Japanese American artists at the time. And Ben Kobashigawa, who was also another SF State professor at the time, I met him and talked with him about because this painter is his uncle. So Ben Kobashigawa, his uncle is Hideo Kobashigawa, and Ben now has most of his uncle's artworks. I'm not actually sure where they are, but Hideo was a very prolific artist. There's an NHK television show that was done on him probably back in the early 2000s when he was still living in a small government subsidized apartment in New York. And they go into his apartment. Every single part of his apartment has stacks of canvases and other artworks all over the place. He would make books as well. He made these very thick books with paintings and some writing inside. Occasionally he would give them away to friends and family. And so I just became super, it made an impression. And then also some of those other details. He was born in Arizona. He was Kibei, like all of my grandparents were Kibei, which is why I'm now Yonsei and not Sansei, because I actually have Kibei grandparents. I always thought my grandparents were Issei because they only spoke Japanese. I didn't know they were Kibei till I was older. So I would say I'm Sansei to everybody, but now I'm technically Yonsei. So sometimes I'll say I'm Kibei Yonsei just to kind of put the Kibei in there, because I think that it's also a difference. That I think it's it can be a different experience for Japanese Americans, especially if they were in camp, to be Kibei, as well as, and then also Hideo was also Okinawan. So that's also another difference, not necessarily. So that's what I think a lot of that fascinated me, and just I felt a connection to, because I never felt like growing up that I was completely a part of the Japanese American community. I lived in the same neighborhood that Jonathan grew up in or lived in, right next to J-Town in San José. but I never went into J-Town except for to go to the Obon once a year. I just went to the Obon. I never shopped there. I never ate there. My mom never took me there. And I always wondered, I mean, I continue to wonder why, and it'll probably come out in the memoir, but I think because she wanted to be close to the culture, but not completely maybe subsumed or controlled by it, because she was a single parent in the 1970s, right? And I think that might have been part of it. And she left the farm when she was 18. And anyway, there's a big story that I hope to write more about her, because I think I'm going off the topic, but anyway, yeah. Any other questions?
You read two poems that were very, very, to me, very graphic and violent. You have a lot of those in your books, and what is it like for that experience to read them, to write them, and to read them, and to think about them? What do you want me as an audience to experience or think about?
Yeah, thank you for that question, because I think about that a lot, and I wanted to talk about it today too. I don't know if these poems, in terms of their violence, is something that, I mean, when I wrote the poems, I didn't think about whether they're too violent or violent or not violent. But I know that, and I didn't read one poem today that's also violent too. I wonder about it myself, and I don't know what I want you to take away from it. I just want you to, this is part of the story. And I think it might come from, what does it mean to share violence like this in a poem and writing? And I'm still wondering what that does mean. I mean, I talked about Wing Tek Lum, and he shared those really graphically violent poems about the Nanjing massacre that had us all kind of like in this other state. But at the same time, if I were to take the violence out of those poems, then you wouldn't know the whole story as well. I don't think I can tiptoe around it. I know there's more questions, so maybe let me think more about it. But yeah, I hope you can tell me what you think about it later.
I was thinking about it, yeah.
Yeah, but what did you?
Well, I certainly understand, your feelings, with Irish Chan poem.
Mm-hmm.
I think all J.A. struggle with that,
Mm-hmm.
that heritage. Like your other poem is, you know what I got? I said, oh, you're a Yonsei. You said you were Yonsei. I don't think a Sansei could write that kind of poem that easily.
Oh, interesting.
On Sansei.
Yeah.
Or more inhibited, or more proper, or something.
But yeah. I have more to say, but maybe later. I think there's another question, right?
I'm glad you wrote those because, violence is part of our life, and it's really important to acknowledge that.
Yeah, thank you. There's a question online?
Yes. Brandon Shimoda, do you know him?
Yes, I do.
So Brandon first wrote, Steve's memoir sounds so beautiful. I can't wait to read and learn from it. And then I have a question. You mentioned the memoir you're writing now, which sounds incredible. And I'm wondering what the process of writing that has been like. And in contrast to writing poetry, are they totally different processes or are there overlaps?
Thanks, Brandon. They are different. There's a difference, but also it's coming from the same place for me. When I'm writing this memoir, actually I haven't been writing it for a while now, but when I'm into it in the same way that I'm often into writing a poem. But writing prose, the memoir is different because I can just kind of freely. I call it rambling. When I presented the memoir to this writing group in August, I said, this is 30 pages of rambling, but I have done some editing. But So there's a difference in that sense in terms of the writing of it, because it's prose, but a lot of my poetry is prose-like too. So I don't know. It kind of blurs for me sometimes, because I just want to get something down on the page. And if it comes out in this way as a memoir, I think because the memoir, I knew I wanted to write more. I wanted to put more detail in there. So yes, I chose that shape or that form for that purpose, because I knew that if I could just write in paragraphs, basically, then I can get down everything that I wanted to get down at that moment. If I focus on writing a poem, like, you can still do that. You're kind of in a different you're in a different flow. Because you're being a little more focused on the language, right, and the sound, and oftentimes it's unconscious, and so you're letting that move that piece of the poem. The memoir, there's a little more intention, although I'll go wherever I want to go with that too, just because I want to just get out, and touch as many points or thoughts that I want to get down. So anyway, I guess I'm still thinking about it.
I want to say, I would love to hear more about the movies, so I'd love to talk to you about that at some point. But there's also a question from Tammy. When writing a lot of these pieces, did they flow quickly and freely, or did some require breaks because they were heavy personally for you? And which is the hardest poem for you to read aloud, and why? Perhaps the poem about Wayne. Which did you want to share with everyone the most?
Well, yeah, I think Tammy is my cousin. Wayne it was the hardest. It wasn't the hardest to write, actually. It's the hardest for me to read now. I used to read it without, I've been reading that poem for a number of years, actually. So as the more I read it, the more somehow it sinks in, what it really means to me, what the loss is. And if I keep talking about it, it kind of just makes me cry, basically. I can't talk about it, but when I wrote it, I sat down. It was an assignment for my SF State workshop. Actually, I had to write a poem because it was due the next day, and I thought, okay, I'm going to just try to write about Wayne. Again, I've been trying to write about him for years, so I'm going to just try to write this poem about him, and that's what came out, basically. It's been edited a little bit, but it came out that way, basically. And then I didn't know if it was good, actually. I would share it with people, and I was like, I don't know if this is a good poem. But I started to get more feedback from other people, and and so I don't know if I'm answering the question entirely, but that is the poem I like to share the most. But there are other poems for sure I also like to share. But they don't take long for me to write usually. Maybe more to edit sometimes. But I usually it just kind of comes out usually. And I'll just most of a lot of other poets and writers will probably have the same experience. A lot of times, what you write is not good at all, but you just keep writing to get to the next thing that you hope will be good. I never know if anything's going to be worth reading at all. You just hope something comes out that's going to be good, and so or meaningful for you.
Well, I was wondering, you mentioned that for your mother, watching films and movies was one of her favorite things to do, and you really enjoyed doing that with her. So what was it about that? Did you actually talk about the movies afterwards, and that's what that interchange, or was it just being there with her and actually experiencing the film?
No, that's a great question. It was real. We didn't talk about these movies. We never talked about these movies. The only thing I would say was, "Oh, I like that movie," or something like that. We never really talked about them. A lot of times it was us, the two of us, sitting together, watching the movie, just silently. But over the years, there's certain movies, that the person likes because they want to. We probably saw Grease like 5 or 6 times in our lives on television, right? And we had the soundtrack that's in my memoir, playing that soundtrack, that double up record album that came out in 1978 with Danny and Sandy on the cover in leather. I mean, that was a huge thing. All kids liked it, adults liked it, so we had that soundtrack and I would play it. And I remember, and I thought Hopelessly Devoted to You was the most boring song on the whole thing. So we'd play the record, and if my mom wasn't in the room, I would skip over the song, or I'd try to skip over it. And then she'd come running out saying, hey, I want to listen to that song. So I got to put the needle back down on that song and listen to that. Over the years, I grew to like the song, and I knew it became a song that was one of her favorites. But yeah, but we used to just sit and watch TV or movies or whatever, just without really any comment. Another film I talk about in my memoirs is when she took me to go see Star Wars in 1977 in San Jose, and we waited in, you know, those famously long lines to get into the theater, like 2 hours. But for me, it was the spectacle, and you know, I was only 7, and the theater we saw it in was this huge domed theater with a massive curtain that would open, you know, in front of this super large screen, and it was like a concert venue the way the seats were arranged, different tiers, and so, you know, but we never talked about it afterwards. We just watched it. I talked about that film with my friends, and we became Star Wars, you know, fans as kids. But yeah, that's a good thing.
As to Grease, though, because it seemed to be a favorite of hers, did you ever conclude why she enjoyed that one so much?
I think she liked the music. I think she liked Olivia Newton-John as a singer and actor. I think that song in particular, maybe was something that she also liked a lot. Was something she liked a lot. She took me to see that movie too in 1978 when it came out. And I just liked it because it was kind of corny and fun to watch. I mean, for a kid, there's so much going on, the activity, and there's just a sort of humor that's kind of corny and kid, almost to a kid's, at least to me as a kid, to their interest, and then the music. So I think there was just a good comment. But you know, it's a classic. I mean, it's a combination of all that. I think she liked it though because yeah, the music, we played the double record many times during that time when we had it. Yeah. So, but also maybe the romance. I mean, there was some of the films, you know, the romance between Sandy and Danny, or the problematic, the tension, and I think that kind of story too was probably, I mean, not to be cliche, but that was probably another kind of story my mom liked when watching films. I can think of so many other films that we watched together, but the Grease, just because of what happened to me when going to the boarding care home when she died, and that song coming on the radio, I had to start there. I just started there. I didn't have to start there. I just started there and tried to go on to. But yeah, we just would. My mom was a quiet person. She didn't, and she enjoyed her solitude after she retired. She retired a little early, and she enjoyed just living on her own and doing her own thing. But then Alzheimer's, you know, she got diagnosed in 2014, and that sort of decline started. But the cool thing is that when I was living with her for a year, because at that point I had to care for her, and so at that point I started to read poems to her, because I wanted to get her feedback, especially the poems about family. So I read the Wayne poem. I didn't read the poems about her though that I had written, but I read other family poems, and so she would give me her feedback at that moment. And in general, she liked them. And then I would joke, you know, well, are you just saying that because you're my mom? And I think one time she said yes, but she liked the poems, and I'm glad I had that time with her to be able to share some of those poems with her, because knowing her, I knew she was engaged when she was listening to certain things I was reading. I have a really, anyway, why don't we just go on to the next? We could talk for. Are there other questions?
There's a question here from Kathy Crystal. Who are your favorite poets? Are they Asian?
A lot of them are Asian American. I have to say though, when I was a young college kid in the 90s, you know, I have to say Robert Hass. I mean, a lot of people kind of see Robert Hass as the big. Robert Hass was one that I went to the community of writers in the, it used to be called Squaw Valley, but you know, they've changed it to the community of writers, and it's in Tahoe, and it's a convening of writers, poets. I went to the Poets Workshop. So Robert Hass was a poet whose work I liked and who came to my campus, and I heard him read, and I knew he was teaching there, so I wanted to work with him, and this is in 1997. So I have to kind of give, that's one influence, but at the same time I was reading other poets. I mean, like the first Japanese American poets that I was exposed to were Garrett Hongo, David Mura, and Janice Mirakatani. And I got to see them all read live at that time. And it seemed like there were very few others. I mean, there were anthologies and there were other people. But I was just getting to know. But today, so yes, I was an English major. So being an English major, you're exposed to a lot of white writers, basically. And you and I learned to read a certain way. So I'll just quickly say this little story. When I tried to read No No Boy by John Okada as an undergraduate, I couldn't read it. In fact, I rejected it because I thought the writing was poor and was badly written. And I realized later that I was an English major who was learning this way of reading and learning what was being told to me as good writing in English. And I couldn't, that learning, when I encountered John Okada's book, and I had no one else to kind of point me in a direction to tell me what was good about it. So I was just trying to read it on my own. I thought, oh yeah, this book is not that great. I'm not really into it, and I closed it. And I went back to it maybe about 5-6 years later, and I read it again. And I had already been changing my thoughts about things, and I ended up liking it, but I still didn't really understand. I didn't like it still that much, but I read the whole thing. And so I've been on this 20-year journey of reading that book at different times. And I listened to an audio version of the book, and I thought it was a superb version by this Asian American actor, and I'm forgetting his name. I think he's Taiwanese American. It's just a wonderful reading of the book, John Okada's No No Boy, if you get a chance. I checked it out in the library, the audio version. So yeah, I was educated this way, and it's taken me many, many years to kind of come to these other writers that I now really enjoy. A lot of Asian American BIPOC writers, actually. A lot of writers in the Bay Area that I know of are some of my favorite writers. Yeah, and that's a wonderful thing living here, I think, for me. There's so many great writers and so many different writers. But yeah,
Are you part of a writing collective? Where you get feedback?
I have a writing group. We were 3, now we're 2, so I don't know if that's still a group, but yeah, we're Japanese American, and we focus on writing. A lot of our writing is focused on that, on Japanese American culture, topics, our lives. So yes, I've been. Now it's 2 of us, because one of us kind of got real busy. she's kind of moving out there. She's gotten some really great publications and awards, and she's really moving forward with a book of her own. And so, but the other 2 of us are still meeting. We're trying to meet once a month at least. Yeah, we're not putting too much pressure on ourselves, but it's good to gather with other people. I recommend it if you are interested in our writing, that you have a group where you have some way of sharing your work regularly with others. I don't think you can. It's hard to get better or to know if you're. Yeah. In the writing group that I was in, they read this book maybe 2 or 3 times. Gave me feedback on it. So yeah, I really appreciate Marjorie and Amanda, the 2 that were in the group.
Any other questions?
I'd like to ask one. I was going to ask if you had read your poems to your mother and what she thought, but you just answered that. I also wanted to mention that you said you didn't have funny poems, but I thought the one line in that poem about your mother where you said you're trying to remember names, her friends' names,
Yeah.
and you say, I forgot.
Yeah.
That was funny. But how do you think your mother found ways to be expressive? It seems like it, she was creative in her own way, right?
Well, if you didn't know her, you probably would have not have. She really just stayed to herself. She had very few friends. Two good friends that I can recall throughout her life, and they both passed away before she did. And I really don't. I mean, well, there were a couple of other friends that she kind of saw afterwards, but she didn't stay friends with them. And she really seemed to genuinely like to be, like she liked her solitude. But what she did mainly was kind of stay at home, and she liked to take a walk. But yeah, it's hard. That's why I'm trying to write this memoir, because I want to get more to who she was as a young girl and kind of growing up, you know, in the Bay or San Jose. Well, she lived most of her life in San Jose, but that's what I'm trying to get at. I think because I know who she was. I mean, I can just, you know, she didn't have to explain her. We don't have to explain ourselves to each other, my mother and I. But telling others who she is very difficult, and it's difficult for me to express. She did express herself in what she liked to watch. Yeah, films, right? And then her reading. I think I like films and books today because she always was reading and watching movies. As a child, she had boxes of books in her closet. And I would go in there sometimes and I'd kind of pull one out or whatever. I didn't really start reading myself until I was actually a little bit older. I wasn't like a child reading all these books and becoming super. I watched a lot of TV and just played with friends, and I was kind of this sort of pop culture kid, maybe. I didn't start reading more seriously until maybe high school. And then I started to realize that my mom always had these books, that she always had a book, and she was always going to the library. Even as a kid, she'd bring me to the library. And even though I wouldn't maybe check out a book, she always checked out a couple of books. And that probably, I'm sure that, yeah. So I'm trying to figure out how to tell who she really was more. She liked, anyway, never mind. She liked Japanese food.
Can you tell us about your other book event that you have?
Yeah, this is like my second to last one almost. Well, I'm going to be at the J-Sei holiday marketplace to sign more books. My last event will be at BAM PFA, the UC Berkeley Art Museum and Pacific Film Archive. It'll be in person. That's the museum that I work at. And I'll be doing a talk and book signing, kind of solo talk and reading. So, you know, Sunday, December 4th at 3:30. And if you want to go, let me know. You can email me or get in touch, and I'll put your name on the list for complimentary admission. Otherwise, the museum will charge gallery admission, even to go see me there. So just let me know. Even if you're not sure, just say, hey, I think I would like to go. I'll put your name on the list so that you can. And if you can't make it, no worries. But same day before my book reading at BAM PFA, I'll be here at 12 to 2 o'clock. Signing my book, and if you want, it'll be available for purchase, I guess, at that time too.
Well, thank you, Steve. I think the people who are here and who are watching have a very good sense of who you are.
Thanks.
Very good sense, and the book of poetry here is very revealing, very reflective, and quite diverse. So, thank you very much.
Well, thank you, everybody. Appreciate you all being here and online and in person. And it's a great space. I love it. It's just